where it is written, so they, meaning the spies, the 12 spies, went up and explored the land from the desert of Zin as far as Rehob and toward Lebo Hamath. They went up through the Negev and came to Hebron, where Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai, the descendants of Anak, lived. Hebron had been built 7 years before Zoan in Egypt. When they reached the valley of Eshcol, they cut off a branch bearing a single cluster of grapes. 2 of them carried it on a pole between them, along with some pomegranates and figs. That place was called the Valley of Eshcol because of the cluster of grapes the Israelites cut off there. At the end of the 40 days, they returned from exploring the land. They came back to Moses and Aaron and the whole Israelite community at Kadesh in the desert of Paran. There they reported to them and to the whole assembly, showing them the fruit of the land. They gave Moses this account. We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does indeed flow with milk and honey. Here is its fruit. But the people there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites live in the Negev. The Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites live in the hill country. And the Canaanites live near the sea and along the Jordan. Then Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, "We should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it." But the men who had gone up with him said, "We can't attack those people. They are stronger than we are." And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they had explored. They said, "The land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there." The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. "We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." I want to encourage you to keep your Bible open as we're going to be going through this passage very quickly and just referring to some different verses as we go. And I'll do the pastoral prayer just before the communion. Now, the message today, if you look in your bulletin, the notes are there. The question is, what do we do now? And I think it's something that happens to all of us at one time or another. We've prepared for something. We enjoyed success. We felt elated, satisfied. And then we wake up the next morning. And there's a hole in our day, there's a hole in our life where all of that used to take up our time and divide our attention. And so we ask the obvious question, what now? Just last evening we attended a wedding service, and you all recall that time in your life where you woke up the next morning and said, what now? What do we do now? This big event in our lives, we've had it, it's behind us, but now what? It's the feeling that Simon Peter had on the day after Jesus had appeared to all of them as disciples. And, you know, Peter, being a man's man and a forward thinker, said, "Well, I'm going fishing." "Okay, Peter." And a number of the disciples joined him as well. And Jesus appeared to them again there on the shore. This is also a twice yearly feeling for pastors, one that is most keenly described after Easter. And so I'm not a fan of the weather today, but I'm grateful that it didn't happen a week ago. The post-Easter blues are what they call it, and when they come along, you've had a chance to worship, and you've had the excitement of Easter Day and Holy Week leading up to it, and then the morning after, you say, what now? And the Sunday after Easter, the congregation sort of feels that. What now? So, Monday this week just passed, I was feeling a tinge of that. And so my cure was to go to the public library, take down from the shelf a book that had some very negative views about the Bible, and I'm reading through it and making notes, and I hope to post a blog rebutting and arguing with this writer's very negative views, because that's a very good way to improve and strengthen what you do believe, is to test it against something that is contrary. And it put me in a better mood right away. Something about having an adversary or competition. So this morning we're going to take a look at one instance where the people of God, on essentially the morning after, said no. And they didn't make a good decision. And what we'll learn today, very simply but very powerfully, is don't give up on God. Don't give up on God when things get difficult, but continue on. We're going to look at three things very briefly. The first is the 12 spies had 40 days of fruitful research. Look at the passage we just read. The first half of chapter 13 details the very first committee formed in the Bible. The first committee of 12, they were sent to scout, reconnoiter, or spy out the promised land. It was a 40-day trip, which when you think about it is pretty daring, considering they didn't know the language, and they didn't know the culture, they didn't know the territory. The last half of chapter 13 deals with the report that they filed. Now, they had brought along physical evidence. Look at verse 23. They brought along a single cluster of grapes. And when I got started in ministry years and years ago, I had a friend named John Stoddard who commented on this passage, and he said, the grapes were as big as your head. Now, the Bible doesn't say that, and even though it's kind of a fun image, eating a grape as big as your head. I don't think that was really the case. But it was evidence that the land produced good fruit. And they brought it back. And people should have been encouraged by that. The spies themselves said, it is indeed a land flowing with milk and honey. It's all that God promised us and more. Wouldn't that motivate you to go ahead and follow through on the plan of God? And verbally they made it sound appealing as well. But here's where the problem comes in. Point number 2, 10 spies out of the 12 gave up. They gave up on God's promise. After attesting to the quality of the land and showing them examples of its produce, the majority gave up on the Lord when they got to the people who lived in the land. When the subject of the people came up, that's when things started to go south. They said, oh, these people are powerful. They are descendants of Anak. And if you want to know a little bit more about that and the Nephilim, look at Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 to 4. And these were legendary figures, people who were supposedly the product of human women and angels siring children together. Genesis chapter 6. We can't begin to get into that this morning. That's one of those UFO moments in the Bible. But they were using this as an exaggeration. They had looked at these people and they were thoroughly intimidated. They said, they've got fortified cities and they're very large. These people are powerful. They are of great size. They are giants. Now, if you had to line up as a defensive team on the opposite side of any NFL offensive line, you might say the same thing. There's no way I'm going to block or get past this 350-pound guy. And it looked like that to them. They felt overwhelmed, thoroughly intimidated, and were unwilling to go. Now, the two dissenters were Joshua and Caleb. And if you look at verse 30, that's where Caleb voices the minority opinion. He says, we should surely go in. We can take them. And Caleb's confidence was not based on the might of their arms, their strategy. His confidence was based on God. He said, in effect, look, God gave this to us. Why should we stop now? Let's keep going. He was trying to impart some faith-fueled confidence to the crowded characters who formed the majority of the group. Well, the 10 dissenters took their opinion to the people. And with gossip, with slander, the thing began to fall apart. Point number 3, 40 years and 1 generation later, they would finally enter the promised land. Look at chapter 14, verses 1 to 4. They talked about it all night long. They grumbled. They cried. This was a big upset. And they were ready to elect someone to lead them back to Egypt. Now think about this, folks. Back to Egypt, where they were slaves and would be slaves again, presumably. They were going to go back there. They preferred slavery to freedom. Moses, Aaron, Joshua, and Caleb got together in chapter 14, verses 5 to 9, to try to reason with them, to talk them out of this dumb idea. And their reaction to the speech that these men of God made was very violent. Verse 10 tells us that in order to make room for new leadership, they were going to kill the ones at the top. They were picking up stones and looking for good ones in order to throw them at Moses, Joshua, Caleb, and Aaron and kill them. And in verse 10, what saved these men of God was God himself appearing at the tent of meeting, at the tabernacle. God showed up in his glory. And all the way back in Exodus chapter 20, the people of Israel had cowered at the glory of God. They were afraid of his presence. And so this stopped the angry mob. And God spoke with Moses. And got to admit, God's reaction sounds a little extreme too. He was justifiably angry with this nation that was supposed to be following him. And if you look at chapter 14, verses 11 and 12, he says, how long am I going to put up with these people? How long are they going to treat me with contempt? They refuse to believe in me in spite of all the miraculous signs. And in this part, not for the first time, God said to Moses, look, Moses, let's start over. I'll wipe them out, and I'll use you and your family, and we'll make a new nation. He says in verse 12, I will strike them down with the plague. Now folks, this is not an empty threat. God is not making this statement and not intending to follow through. Though the nation was saved because Moses intervened, the 10 negative spies were killed. And how were they killed? By a plague. Just as God warned, just as God said, these rabble-rousers, these troublemakers, were struck down in verses 36 to 38 of chapter 14. But Moses interceded for the nation. He didn't take up God on his offer. He said to God in verses 13 to 19, look, Father, God, if you kill the nation now, what kind of witness is that going to be? What are the nations, and particularly the Egyptians, going to think? You have demonstrated your great power, and the rest of the nations are talking about it, and they are in fear of us. If you were to suddenly strike them all dead, what would happen then? And his second appeal was to the character of God, both sides of God's character. He said that, God, you are love. You are slow to anger, abounding in love, and forgiving sin and rebellion. Look at chapter 14, verses 17 and 19. But God is love, but he is also holy. And so the holiness of God is in chapter 14, verse 18, where Moses has said, he does not leave the guilty unpunished. And so indeed, God punished the guiltiest among them, the 10 spies who had given up. God forgave them, but he did not tolerate their sin. And if you look at verse 20, God says to Moses, well, I've already forgiven them. Thanks for the advice. I've already forgiven them. And when God and Moses have these conversations, my sense is that these conversations, these intercessions are not for God's sake. It's not that he changed his mind, but they're for Moses' sake, to renew his leadership and his integrity to the people. Now, forgiveness is obviously a very good thing. But forgiveness, to be legitimate, doesn't always seek to relieve the consequences of sin. We have to learn, and most of us have to learn the hard way, it seems. And these people are no exception. And so God said to Moses, yes, I forgive them, but they're going to have to learn. And the generation that had been guilty of committing these sins against the Lord. Look at verse 22. They had disobeyed and tested him. Look at verse 23. They had treated him with contempt. Look at verse 27 in chapter 14. They had grumbled against him. So God said to Moses, in effect, look, if they want to go back to Egypt, I will send them in that direction. And in verse 25, he gave Moses new orders. Go back the way you came. That's kind of ironic justice, isn't it? God gave them what they wanted, but it wasn't what they thought it was going to be. It would take 40 years to satisfy God's wrath, but he did not order the Hebrews to return and enter the promised land until every member of that generation had expired. It's serious. The people repented, we see in verses 39 to 45, but they disobeyed the Lord again, a second time, and received a whooping in return for their foolishness. I think the death of the ringleaders in verses 36 to 38 must have frightened and intimidated them. And you could say it put the fear of God into them. When Moses repeated all that God said, look at verse 39, they mourned bitterly. And after what was probably another sleepless night, they were all ready to repent and obey God's original instructions. But they were too late. And this illustrates for us the importance of the principle of obedience in time. That part of complete obedience is to obey when the instructions are received, not when it's convenient, not when we want to. I think we've all had a struggle with this with children, or we're guilty of it ourselves. Take out the trash, Mom says, in the morning. The morning passes. The afternoon passes, and supper is ready, and Mom says, the trash is still here. They had their opportunity to go in, and they refused. And God said, it'll be a long time before you go in again. But they were so stubborn, they were so sure that they could fix this, that they raised an army, and they went into the promised land, and they picked a fight with the first people that they saw, and they were sent running back over the border. And I want to point something out to you. Look at verse 44. Moses warned them that this would be a disaster, and sure enough it was, but the text specifically says that neither Moses nor the Ark of the Covenant went across the river to join the battle. And this is God's way of saying to them, this is not my plan for you. This is not what I ordered you to do. I ordered you to pick up and go back the way you came. But now your disobedience and your foolishness, you think you can do it yourself. Well, knock yourself out. Let's see what happens. But Moses and the ark, which is the symbol of the presence of God, that stayed. The point, folks, is don't give up on God. Because Easter, just as Easter is not the end of the story of Jesus, it is not the end of our story either. There is a lot of living, loving, and serving in the days ahead. We should be grateful for what God has given us on Easter, but the morning after, we pick up and we start again. Empowered, excited, enlightened, but we know we're going to keep. Now, I'm going to paraphrase for you what Jesus told his disciples the last thing before he left earth. He said to them, it's time. It's time to get to work. There's a whole world out there full of people who need to hear about what I've done. It needs you. But I will be with you always. So God calls us not to give up on him. Let's go to our time of prayer now. And our God and Father, we want most of all to learn from the bad example of the Israelites. We want to learn to obey. We want to learn to obey immediately and fully. We want to learn, Lord God, that he who began a good work in you is going to carry it on to completion in Christ Jesus.